They whispered it first among battalions, in officers' messes, and guarded letters home. Long before the Allied bombs fell upon Dresden, and years before Hitler's pistol echoed in the bunker beneath Berlin, some of Germany's most capable generals already knew. The war could not be won. This is the story of that fatal insight, a creeping realization that spread through the very men who had once believed they commanded destiny itself. In the summer of 1941, the Wehrmacht stood at its zenith. The world trembled before its precision and speed, but beneath the confidence ran a quieter unease. This is the story of how arrogance turned to doubt, and doubt hardened into a grim certainty that would lead Germany to annihilation. To understand their doubt, we must first understand their belief. The interwar years had been a period of humiliation for the German officer corps, constrained by the Treaty of Versailles. Men like Heinz Guderian, the father of the panzer divisions, and Erich von Manstein, a strategic genius, developed revolutionary doctrines of mechanized warfare. When Hitler unleashed them, the results were staggering. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was not just a tactic, it was a vindication. The campaign in France, which had cost Germany millions of lives in a 4-year stalemate in the First World War, was over in 6 weeks. The generals were heroes. They had restored Germany's military honor. At the heart of the machine was the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl were Hitler's closest military advisors. But they were also his enablers, rarely questioning his strategic vision, which was increasingly driven by ideology rather than sound military principles. Their blind loyalty would prove fatal. As the Wehrmacht turned its eyes east towards the Soviet Union, this faith in Hitler's genius was at its absolute peak. They were about to launch the largest invasion in human history, believing it would be the final glorious campaign. When Operation Barbarossa began, Hitler's prophecy of destroying Bolshevism in a single campaign seemed plausible. 3 massive army groups drove deep into Soviet territory. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks. Prisoners flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. But veterans of the First World War recognized a dangerous familiarity. The front was too wide, the logistics too fragile. Heinz Guderian's panzers raced so far ahead, they often outran their own fuel and ammunition. Infantry followed days behind, leaving the flanks vulnerable to counterattack. The autumn rains, the infamous Rasputitsa, turned the dirt roads into impassable rivers of mud, halting the advance for weeks. Then came the winter. By November 1941, as the first snow fell on troops still in their summer uniforms, the unease hardened into dread. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. German equipment, not designed for such extremes, failed. Tank engines wouldn't start. Machine guns froze solid. More soldiers were lost to frostbite than to combat. And the Soviet Union had not collapsed. Fresh divisions, equipped for winter warfare, appeared from Siberia to defend Moscow. On December 5th, the Red Army, under General Georgy Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive. The invincible Wehrmacht stalled, and then, for the first time, it broke and retreated. Hitler was furious. He fired dozens of generals, including Guderian, and issued his infamous stand-fast order, forbidding any retreat. While this may have prevented a total collapse, it cemented a new, disastrous reality. Hitler was now in direct command of tactical decisions, and he would not tolerate dissent. In the frozen dugouts outside Moscow, the first fatal doubts began to take root. The war was not a lightning campaign. It was a war of attrition. A war Germany, with its limited resources and manpower, could not possibly win. In 1942, Hitler demanded renewed offensives. He devised Case Blue, a massive drive south to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city on the Volga, named after his nemesis, Stalingrad. The plan was bold but reckless, dividing the German army's strength across immense distances. Generals like Fedor von Bock protested, warning it risked catastrophe. Hitler dismissed him. "You always see black clouds," he snapped. The Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, was one of the finest in the Wehrmacht. They reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late August. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic value of the city, ordered them to take it at any cost. This decision turned a war of maneuver into a meat grinder. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. While the Sixth Army was being bled white in the city, the Soviets were gathering a massive force on its thinly held flanks, which were defended by poorly equipped Romanian and Italian armies. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. The encirclement stunned Berlin, but not the officers on the ground who had seen the warning signs. General Paulus pleaded with Hitler for permission to attempt a breakout. The Führer's response was unequivocal. "I am not leaving the Volga." Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised he could supply the trapped army from the air, a promise he could not possibly keep. Field Marshal von Manstein attempted a relief operation, but it failed. Inside the frozen city, the Sixth Army perished. Of the nearly 300,000 men trapped, only 91,000 would surrender. Of those, a mere 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad shattered the myth of invincibility forever. It was a catastrophe born of Hitler's hubris and his generals' obedience. The unspoken question spread like a contagion. If this could happen to the Sixth Army, what hope remained? The spring of 1943 brought no real recovery, only the illusion of one. Hitler was determined to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. He planned a massive counteroffensive, Operation Citadel, aimed at a huge salient in the Soviet line around the city of Kursk. It would be the last great German gamble of the war. Many generals, including Manstein and Guderian, privately doubted the plan. The element of surprise was gone. Soviet intelligence, aided by spies, knew exactly where and when the attack would come. The Red Army had spent months building the most extensive network of defenses in history. Millions of mines, miles of trenches, and thousands of anti-tank guns. Hitler hesitated, delaying the offensive to wait for more of the new powerful Tiger and Panther tanks. This delay gave the Soviets even more time to prepare. When the attack finally launched on July 5, 1943, it was into a fortress. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, a brutal slugging match. The German panzers, despite their technological superiority, were decimated by the sheer weight of the Soviet defenses. When the offensive collapsed just over a week later, there would be no more major German victories in the east. After Kursk, the strategic outcome of the war was sealed. The generals now fought a retreating war. They could not win. They could only manage the defeat. Even the most loyal officers now sensed the inevitable. Hitler still ranted about miracle weapons and indomitable will, but the men who commanded his soldiers could read the maps. The war would not end with victory or negotiation. It would end with destruction. By the end of 1943, the mood inside the officer corps had changed entirely. German industry could no longer replace losses. The U-boat fleet was being annihilated in the Atlantic, and everyone knew the Allies would soon strike in the West. The only questions were where and when. Tasked with defending the coast of France was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Unlike many of his peers, Rommel was a pragmatic frontline commander. Touring the defenses, he quickly realized the Atlantic Wall was a propaganda myth. The situation was hopeless. The enemy's material and air superiority was overwhelming. On June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. Within days, it was clear the front could not be held. Rommel and his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, pleaded with Hitler for the freedom to maneuver their panzer divisions, but Hitler, micromanaging from hundreds of miles away, refused. The panzers were released too late. As military defeat became certain, some officers contemplated the unthinkable, removing Hitler himself. These were not just idealists disgusted by Nazi crimes. They were professional soldiers who concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to total annihilation. To kill him, they reasoned, was not treason. It was salvation. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a briefcase bomb into Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair. The explosion killed 4 men, but a heavy oak table leg shielded Hitler from the blast. He survived. The failure of the plot was a catastrophe for the officer corps. The Gestapo launched a brutal crackdown. Thousands were arrested. Rommel, implicated in the plot, was forced to commit suicide. Others were subjected to humiliating show trials and brutally executed. The officer corps was decimated by its own despair. Any illusion of internal reform was extinguished. The surviving generals now understood. The regime would destroy itself, and them with it. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. And yet, in his bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler continued to issue impossible orders. Armies that no longer existed were ordered to counterattack. Cities were to be held to the last man. Civilians were conscripted into the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. Many generals no longer obeyed. They falsified reports, ignored orders, or quietly arranged the surrender of their commands to the Western Allies to spare them from the Soviets. In April, as the Soviets closed in on Berlin, the last vestiges of discipline disintegrated. In the Führer bunker, Hitler raged at his generals, accusing them of betrayal. On April 22nd, he finally broke down, admitting the war was lost and that suicide was his only escape. For the generals, the moment carried no relief. They had witnessed the end of everything. On May 8, 1945, Field Marshal Keitel signed the unconditional surrender. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The final humiliation of the regime they had served so faithfully was complete. In Allied interrogation rooms and post-war memoirs, the generals spoke freely at last. They blamed Hitler, the SS, the party, anyone but themselves. They created the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, arguing they were honorable soldiers who had been victims of a mad dictator. There was truth in some of these claims, but also profound evasion. The tragedy of Germany's generals was not merely that they recognized defeat too late. It was that even when they did, they lacked the collective will to stop it. They had rationalized their complicity as duty. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the rubble of Berlin, the evidence of failure was plain. By 1943, the war was strategically lost. By 1944, militarily hopeless. By 1945, morally bankrupt. But long before the final capitulation, in the quiet moments between battles, many of Hitler's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. They could see what he could not, that Germany's destiny was sealed not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the arrogance of 1941, when they mistook lightning war for omnipotence and conquest for invulnerability. The tragedy of the Wehrmacht was that it kept fighting long after it knew it was beaten. And in doing so, it ensured that defeat would destroy not only Hitler, but the nation he had promised to make eternal.